anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and of course it was very interesting last night. We will have lots to talk about. Couldn't think of a better person to join us in this first half hour than our good friend Gary Bauer of American Values, individual that served under President Ronald Reagan's administration for 8 years as the Undersecretary of Education and Chief Domestic Policy Advisor. Of course, the President of American Values, also the chairman of the Campaign for Working Families. And Gary Bauer, I guess the speech is finally over. One of the longest ones I've ever heard.
Wait a minute, it's over? I'm still sitting here. That was amazing, even by Trumpian standards. That was quite a lengthy speech. But, Kerby, and I know you do know because you're on as top of the news as I am, the overnight reactions have been incredibly positive. People apparently tuned in and stayed tuned in, and people felt more optimistic about America and thought it was unifying and so forth. So, Trump, he paves his own way, and he appears to have really done something in some ways, very historic last night.
Let's hear something that he said last night.
We have accomplished more in 43 days than most administrations accomplished in 4 years or 8 years, and we are just getting started.
So again, just a little bit of an understanding there. So that, I thought, at first sounds like hyperbole, but if you try to even write down on a piece of paper, and Gary, I know you probably have tried to do that at American Values as your end-of-day report, all the things that have happened within the last month, it is pretty amazing. I remember when Ronald Reagan, who you worked under, hit the ground running, but I don't think I've ever seen anything like this. Have you?
No, I haven't. This is, as is so often the case with President Trump, this is one of a kind. He's, I think the phrase is, he has flooded the zone. He is attacking the left's policies on so many different fronts at the same time that I think intentionally it's sort of disorienting. They don't know where to run to next. And it's also, we shouldn't lose sight of this, it's also being met with a flurry of court decisions by mostly district court judges who are acting like they have a right to tell what the president, what he can do in the entire country. If I were the Supreme Court, I'd be getting very nervous because if district court judges can do that, there's no need to have a Supreme Court. So we're going to see how it all plays out. But yes, on foreign policy, economic policy, just reorienting even the culture of America, the president has accomplished a remarkable amount of things in these opening weeks.
Might just mention we will get to some of those court decisions, including one by the Supreme Court today about USAID, but I think I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about, since I'm broadcasting from the state of Texas, Representative Al Green. When is the last time, again, you're probably a presidential historian, that we've actually had to have the Sergeant of Arms remove somebody from the of the United States House of Representatives, and then in many cases had other people just walk out during the particular speech? That is very unusual.
Yeah, there was a lot of history being made last night, Kerby, and I think the president made good history, but I think these other folks made history too. And it was, you're mentioning the most obvious things that people would have seen, which is, in fact, the congressman getting thrown out of the House. Not that many years ago, a Republican congressman yelled, "You lie," at Barack Obama, and man, the number of wizened old hands that said this is a new low in America, that pales compared to what happened last night. and then people walking out. But, Kerby, even more disturbing than all that, the president told the stories of a dozen American heroes, and all of them there recognized them. There was raucous applause for them. There were tears shed for them. But on the Democrat side of the room, not a hand applauded. It was one of the most disgusting things I have ever seen in all my years in Washington, D.C., and it should trouble any normal Democrat. I mean, there are plenty of people that are Democrats and love America and believe in God and so forth. You folks need to step up because something very sick has taken root inside the Democrat Party.
Again, I know some of our listeners don't watch that, and so I might just mention you had Stephanie Diller, the widow of the police officer. Of course, you had the mother and the sister of Laken Riley, also Jocelyn Nungari. You had that 13-year-old cancer patient, DJ Daniel, who has, also wanted to become a police officer and was made a Secret Service agent. You had the family members of Corey Compatori, who actually shielded those individuals when there was an attempt to assassinate Donald Trump. Mark Fogel, who was actually held in a Russian prison, and to not applaud for any of that, I think, is going to have some repercussions. And the other thing is, even when there were the speech, they had these paddles that said false. Gary, I wish I had one of those when I was in undergraduate school and then graduate school. I could hold those up sometimes when my professor would say something really stupid or something erroneous, because what in the world? Sometimes they had him up when he was giving what were very obvious facts. And there are times when you could maybe disagree about an opinion, but he'd have some facts, some numbers, the number of individuals that are still on the Social Security rolls or the amount of money being spent. And those are pretty obvious facts. And even then, they were holding up those paddles that say false. And again, I've never seen anything like it.
No, I haven't either. And of course, after it was all over, and then the media started doing their fact checking. And one reporter said that when the president said that the small number of border crossings that happened in the month of February, and it was an unbelievably low number, was the lowest number ever. And this fact checker said, well, we didn't keep figures before 1910, so the president was lying. He had no way of knowing whether this from the same people that tell us that tomorrow will be the hottest day ever in Washington, D.C., when we didn't keep temperatures until about 1920. So there's just a lot of silliness out there, but I'm hoping and praying people are beginning to catch on.
I think so. We need to take a break, and I know you're going to be with us a little bit longer, so we'll take a break. We'll come back. I want to play another clip or two and get some comments from Gary Bauer, and then a little bit later, we will, next part of this hour, have Sean McDowell when we talk about this issue of apologetics, but we will also come back to this. I've posted some great takeaways from Trump's congressional address that we'll get into in the second hour, so there are a lot of ways in which we'll try to cover what took place last night, but I also want to get Gary Bauer kind of look ahead, because what does this mean in terms of an agenda for America and just the remarkable number of things that have been taking place that President Donald Trump talked about last night. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Homelessness not only affects big cities, but can be found in small towns as well. Scott Moorfield tells a story about Bristol, Tennessee and Bristol, Virginia that illustrates the impact that public policy can have on social problems like homelessness. First, let's explain the geography. Bristol is really two cities with two governments that are right next to each other. They are divided by a state line that runs down the main street. The division provides a perfect test for the impact of laws and policies. One past example of the differences came during the pandemic and lockdowns. The Democratic Virginia state mandates were much different than the Tennessee policies. It created a weird time where half of the main street was essentially shuttered while the other half prospered. More recently, Tennessee passed a law that made camping on public property a felony. As you might expect, the homeless problem gravitated towards the Virginia side. The kitchen director of the local shelter said that he heard numerous people at the evening meal say, "I'm going to get this meal, and then I'm going to go over to Virginia so I don't have to worry about getting thrown in jail and have a felony on my record." The principle is simple. Remove the incentives and create disincentives for homeless people, and they go elsewhere. In this case, they migrated to the other side of town. It wasn't long before Bristol, Virginia passed a camping ban, though it was merely a misdemeanor offense. 3 months ago, I talked about the book by Michael Schellenberger with the arresting title, San Francisco, Why Progressives Ruin Cities. He documents various reasons why the homeless problem has become worse, but one of the most important reasons is lax enforcement. The two cities of Bristol illustrate how policies do affect homeless behavior. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Gary Bauer with us as we talk about the speech last night. And for those of you keeping score at home, let me point you to our first article. It is written by Gary Bauer. I first saw him mention it in one of his X posts. It's on the stream. New Trump administration is defending faith, family, and freedom. Either he is, if he writes these out, getting carpal tunnel syndrome or writer's cramp, because I think he has like 8 different elements for life, another 5 for the transgender issues, and the list goes on and on and on. So we'll get to that in just a minute. But Gary, before I get to some of the ones that we always talk about, faith, family, and freedom, let's talk about the economy, because here's something the president said.
We suffered the worst inflation in 48 years, but perhaps even in the history of our country. They're not sure. As president, I'm fighting every day to reverse this damage and make America affordable again.
And so, again, just wanting to bring about some kinds of changes because the economy has been a mess. And so whether you look at the eye of inflation or the eye of immigration, those were very big issues in the last campaign, weren't they?
They were very big issues, and they continue to really resonate with the American people. And I think by and large the president's on the right side of these issues. But it's, as we've been talking about here, Kerby, there's still a tremendous split in the country.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not so sure it's among the American people as much as it is between the elites
well said.
And the average guy.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I mean, to see the Congress again this week vote to not ban men from women's sports when the public opinion polls are overwhelmingly with us now.
Yep. As a matter of fact, we have right now some of these take action items at Point of View. The one today is on no taxpayer funding for abortion. The next one's going to be on the DEI and the men in sports, because there are some attempts to actually codify these, because an executive order could be reversed by a future president. Yeah. And so that is certainly the case. But you were talking about the fact that we are split, but it is amazing to me how many times Donald Trump has taken what I would call an 80-20 issue and taken the 80, and then the Democrats find themselves having to defend the 20, and that gets us into another clip from the particular piece on Doge.
And to that end, I have created the brand new Department of Government Efficiency, Doge, which is headed by Elon Musk, who is in the gallery tonight. Because we are draining the swamp. It's very simple. And the days of rule by unelected bureaucrats are over.
Gary Bauer, you have certainly watched politics for a long time. I did not think that the Democratic Party would say the hill I want to die on is actually not cutting any part of the government, given the fact that even in the days of Clinton and Gore, all the way back to, of course, when you were there, remember the Grace Commission under Reagan, there were attempts to cut waste, fraud, and abuse. But nevertheless, that seems to be the idea that although I'd say about 80% of Americans don't think men should be participating in women's sports, about 80% don't think that we should continue to send money to transgender and DEI things overseas, and yet they seem to want to fight on that particular battle, and that doesn't seem to me like a very good hill to die on. What are your thoughts?
Well, I agree completely. You know, right after the election, there were a lot of wise people writing that, man, after this is a wake-up call for the Democrat Party. They're going to move to the center. Now, it would be great for the country if they would move to the center. I'm kind of a partisan myself, and I thought, oh, no, if they move to the center, they might start winning more elections. But I don't think I have anything to worry about. I mean, they are not moving to the center at all. And I think on the values issues, they will not give a centimeter on supporting abortion all 9 months of the pregnancy. And on these LGBT issues, they're willing to die on the hill of hairy-legged men walking into your daughter or granddaughter's locker room and swimming against them and running against them and so forth, which almost everybody has concluded is insane. And then finally, to put your stake in the ground and say, I will protect the Washington, D.C. swamp no matter what happens, man, they need to they need to get some help. I mean, this is really, have we infiltrated their party and are getting them to do really stupid things? Everybody knows that waste in this city is a terrible problem, and it just goes from year to year without anybody ever doing anything about it.
Well, again, where is the party going? Because, we've talked about in the past Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But another one that has really surfaced over the last couple of days, and I mentioned him yesterday, and I've got an article that we'll get into in the second hour, Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut, who in some really almost out of the fever swamps, arguing that what this really is an attempt by Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump to actually steal all the minerals from Ukrainians, at the same time trying to go in and get all of the information from the Social Security Administration and to raid Medicare and Medicaid. And I just have a question as to if this is kind of becoming the future leader of the Democratic Party. It does not bode well even for the midterm elections, does it?
It doesn't, and you're right. I mean, he's a senator that's being talked up as the kind of guy that can lead the party to victory. It is the most reasonable thing in the world after we sent $300 billion to Ukraine to help them preserve their independence, that now we would hope that they would want to cooperate with us and help us get access to some minerals that we desperately need for the big war that may happen down the road, which is a war with communist China that we could very well lose. So this is a natural thing to do. The fact that we've gone so far down the road that we don't even think, after we've helped a country as much as we've helped Ukraine, that we have any claim on them doing anything for us. That this would come as quite a shock to Dwight David Eisenhower and FDR and all the leaders we've had over many, many years in America.
Well, and even this idea that, well, you can't talk to the Russians. And I'm thinking, do you remember when Truman sat down with Stalin? And you remember when Eisenhower had to wonder whether or not we should fight the Soviet Union in Hungary and Czechoslovakia? I mean, sometimes you have to make some prudent decisions. And so, again, we can get into foreign policy, but I wanted to at least have you raise one other issue, and that is I'm a real fan of the End of Day report. We, of course, have a link so that people can find out more about American values. And we also have a link today to the Campaign for Working Families. So you got all sorts of ways in which you can connect up with Gary. But a while back, you raised a very good question, and that is I'm starting to see, as a matter of fact, just down the road from where we're broadcasting today, an individual came back from the Congress, and there were people, just wall-to-wall people, shouting him down over the issue of Doge. And you have suggested that maybe that isn't so much grassroots as it is AstroTurf. Can you explain?
Yes, that's exactly right, Kerby. There have been a number of investigative journalists that have looked at this. These are groups, left-wing groups with national followings. Many of them are funded by George Soros and other far-left billionaires in America. And they gin up these audiences, and the whole point of going to the meeting in the district or in a state where the senator is having one of these meetings is to intimidate them, to scare them, to make them think that there's a tremendous backlash because the left knows that they can just scare a handful of Republicans in the House or the Senate, and none of the president's agenda will get through. So we need to go to these meetings and stiffen the spine of our elected officials. Kerby, I know we're running out of time, but one final thought that I wanted to get in here is that I think one of the most important lines in the president's speech really has gotten very little attention. Toward the end, he's speaking of the transgender issue, but it transcends that. He said this, talking to America's children. He said, and our message to every child in America is that you are perfect, exactly the way God made you.
Yes.
That is an incredible line. That is full of significance, and it shows you that Donald Trump, some may think it's unlikely for him to be doing it, but he understands the war in our culture. He is saying a biblical idea that God created us perfectly in his image. America was built on that idea, and to have a president of the United States say it to the United States Congress and the American people is incredibly valuable.
Again, I thought that was a great line. My wife and I both just couldn't believe that actually he said it. Gary Bauer, always great to have you on the program. Look forward to the next opportunity. We're going to take a break, and we'll be back right after this.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult, and that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
As you know, we talk so much about how to articulate a biblical worldview and also how to defend a biblical worldview. Part of that involves what we call apologetics, and that is something we're going to be talking about now. You may be familiar with a book that came out in the past by Dr. Sean McDowell, which was entitled Apologetics for a New Generation. This one now is one that updates that and looks at a number of issues. Apologetics for an ever-changing culture, a biblical and culturally relevant approach to talking about God. Sean McDowell is the general editor. And again, Dr. Sean McDowell, Associate Professor of Christian Apologetics at Talbot School of Theology, probably best known for being the author of so many great books and having a wonderful YouTube channel, which we send you to as well. And of course, have a link to his website. So, Sean McDowell, always great to have you on the program.
Kerby, it's a treat, my friend. I always look forward to this.
300 pages, 3 sections, a new culture, new methods, new challenges. I was going through there. There are about 30 people that either are writing articles in this or that you have interviewed. And a majority, I think I counted at least 17 of the 30, are individuals that have been on this program. So this is familiar territory. And I think one of the reasons why people might want to get a copy of the book, because you give an introduction, then you give a number of individuals a chance to address some of those issues, and then you do interviews with Adam Davidson or Lee Strobel or John Marriott or Jeff Myers or whoever it might be. And in some respects, this is a new book, although some of the material was found in the previous book, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. And by the way, if you've done 17 of 30, I just gave you 13 more guests to consider in the future.
Yeah, there are a couple of them go, okay, I don't know who that is, so we'll get them on. First of all, I got Brent Kuckel and Josh McDowell and John Stone Street and Derwin Gray and Natasha Crane, who was on Monday. And I go all the way down. I have to go really, actually, I maybe have more than 17 because I'm starting looking at that. There's only a few people that I haven't had on. But anyway, that I think is a good, and of course, you have had them on YouTube. And let's talk about that for a minute before we talk about the book, because I know a lot of our younger listeners say, reading a 300-page book, not a chance. Going to the really well-done YouTube channel of Sean McDowell, okay, I'm interested. So again, we have a link so that people can find your YouTube channel, and you get into just all sorts of different issues when you talk about this idea of thinking biblically, don't you?
I do, yeah. Now, I skipped your first question by accident, but just to frame this for folks, what makes the book unique is 2 things. Is one, we're asking what are the new questions in culture that we as disciples of Jesus, apologists who care about reaching our neighbors, need to be aware of and need tips to engage on. So deconstruction, new thought, mental health. A lot of these are apologetic kinds of issues. Second, what are strategic ways to do this? How do we do apologetics well online? How do we do it well in the family? Natasha Crane wrote a chapter that's worth the price of the book alone, How to Do This with Your Kids. So it's a book about doing apologetics practically. It's a how-to book in light of our cultural moment. Now, the YouTube channel, you're right, is very different than a book. People can watch it at double speed if they want to. But that lane of that is apologetics and its worldview. And I really do 2 things, Kerby. Number one, I interview a lot of experts. So just today I posted an interview with Alan Schleman from Stand to Reason, and we titled it 7 Questions to Ask Your Muslim Friends. So I'm hoping some Muslims respond, and some already have, but also to equip Christians how to engage their Muslim friends with the right questions in the right way. So I cover near-death experiences, and I cover evidence for the resurrection and evidence from intelligent design. But I also have a lot of conversations with people who see the world differently. I recently had a friendly debate with a progressive Christian. I recently had a friendly debate with Preston Sprinkle, who has some different views that I have on like gay identity and pronouns, but just trying to model for people. You can have good conversations with people who see the world differently if you approach it in the right way.
I might also mention that there's a whole series of posts, and some of the pictures of Sean from a long time ago is an illustration of the fact that when we are talking about teenagers, you're not a teenager, you have teenagers. But let's get into that, because the foreword by David Kinnaman, and of course he is with the Barna Group and has been looking at this for some time. Things have changed. We recognize you go from the baby boom generation to the kind of the baby bust. You have Generation X, Generation Y, Generation Z. Now talking about Generation Alpha. The world has changed dramatically, hence the reason why you felt that it was need to not only talk about new methods, but even just the fact that we have a new culture, don't we?
Yeah, some of these changes are really significant, because this was a book that I first compiled in 2008, which means I wrote it with contributors in 2007, almost 2 decades ago. And you see how things have changed online, for example. I mean, that's when social media was just coming out. So we've got a whole chapter from Alan Parr, who has a huge YouTube channel, over 1 million subscribers, called The Beat. And he just engages people really well and gives some practical tips for anybody to defend the faith in that world. One of the big shifts, Kerby, is in the area of mental health, depression, and loneliness and anxiety. I hadn't heard anybody talk about how does this affect the way we evangelize people? How much of this is emotional versus experiential versus your worldview? So Jeremiah Johnston from Prestonwood Baptist did a great chapter on how we can approach this apologetically. Since the time I first wrote it, there's been a lot of talk about ex-evangelicals, deconstruction, deconversion. So I interview a co-author of mine, a book you and I talked about a while ago on deconstruction, John Marriott, about what's going on, why are people disengaging the church, what can we do better? So those are just 3 examples of how radically, but another big one is the new thought and new age, I think, has exploded in interest. I mean, the church was focused on new atheism for like the first decade of the 2000s, and still atheism and agnosticism are way smaller worldview spiritual interests in people than reincarnation, than tarot cards, the new age. So we need to be aware of what that is, and no one tackles that issue better than Melissa Doherty, in my view.
So many good ones. I might just mention those of you that get my commentary. The one I did for Monday was actually Rebels Manifesto, because I knew we were getting up and gearing up for Sean McDowell. So that's another book that I would certainly recommend. Of course, that's in the Monday commentary. But let's, if we can, maybe just for a second go to your father, because one of the things he talks about is the whole study of hardwired to connect. And it does seem to me that sometimes we get so involved in talking about kind of a left hemisphere logical linear presentation, or yesterday we did talk about a right hemisphere kind of cultural appreciation, but here it helps us understand that oftentimes embedded in the various interactions we have with individuals is values, beliefs, and relationships, and that, I think, is something we're going to have to pay even more attention to in the 21st century, don't you think?
Yeah, first off, you can always pivot to my dad, Kerby. He's my hero, and I think he's just modeled doing apologetics well for now 6 decades. One of the unique things about my dad is if you look at peers for him, people like Geisler, for example. Geisler talked about truth. James Dobson, Gary Smalley talked about relationships. My dad wrote books called Evidence That Demands a Verdict and More Than a Carpenter, and then books called How to Be a Hero to Your Kids and The Secret of Loving. His ministry was always relationships and truth. And biblically, that's the balance that we have, is that God gives us truth, and it's truth that sets us free. But as you hinted earlier, truth, what we believe, our worldview, is shaped by relationships. Now, that might be a relationship with somebody by listening to the radio, watching their podcast or their YouTube channel, reading their books, but most by people in the flesh whom we know shape our beliefs. So that is one of the first chapters in the book. It's one of my favorite. I got more feedback on that one because people look at my dad as like this great defender of the truth. And he starts by telling a story that he saw a banner for a church that said, "We preach the truth and the truth only at this church." And he's like, that saddened me because we're supposed to preach the truth in relationships. So he would say to me over and over again, he'd say, son, biblical truth is there to be lived out in relationship. That's what it's for. Mm-hmm. And so we wanted to start the book with that balance so we can be better defenders of truth ever. But if we're not loving our neighbors, if we're not living this out in relationship, as you know, Kerby, there's no point.
Let's take a break. We'll come back and maybe talk about some of the new challenges. We certainly have a new culture and new methods, but some of the challenges and some of the additional chapters in the book are some of the issues we talk about around the table, but a few that maybe we haven't. And we'll get into that with Sean McDowell right after these important messages.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Sean McDowell with us for a few more minutes, talking about apologetics for an ever-changing culture. By the way, published by Harvest House. Look for it in your local bookstore. Of course, we also have a link to Sean McDowell's website. That's where you can find also many of his books, as well as the YouTube channel. And I thought I might pick out a few things that we have been talking about here on Point of View, and you address as well. One of those is urban apologetics. We've had Christopher Brooks on. He wrote a chapter on that. You could have just as easily used an individual, Derwin Gray, who wrote about effective apologetics in the local church. But it does seem to me that that's another one of those issues. For a while, it seemed like, first of all, almost all the people doing apologetics were white males. Then we started seeing some females. Now we're seeing African Americans. And I think that's a good trend. But this whole idea of urban apologetics, I think, is something that we need to get the church to think more about in terms of reaching out into urban areas. Don't you think?
I do. It was really Chris Brooks who helped me to see this. He wrote an article years ago, I think it was in Christianity Today, and he was talking about apologetics in the urban setting and how it's just as important in a non-urban setting, but needs to be presented maybe in a different way, and people are wrestling with different questions. Now, looking back, that feels so obvious to me, but when I read that years ago, I was like, that makes sense, because I was invited, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 years ago to speak in an urban setting, and I just approached the questions that were pressing to me and assumed it was pressing to them rather than saying, okay, wait a minute, what questions are they wrestling with? Mm-hmm. How can I help given their context? And of course, some of the questions are the same. Does God exist? Is the Bible true? Biblical sexual ethics? But I just ran into an African-American apologist in Jason's Deli like 2 days ago. He was reading by another Talbot professor, so I introduced myself, and he goes, oh my goodness, I recognize you. I want to be in apologetics. And he said, but I want to write a book on whether Christianity is a white man's religion.
Good.
Now, that's not a topic I think about a lot. It's not pressing in my context. But to him and to many urban contexts, that's a pressing issue. And so I just said, thank God for you. Write that, do that. How can I help was kind of my approach. So that's why we've got to think differently, but also be willing to serve this community as we do other communities who are asking real apologetic questions.
Well, and the other thing I thought was so interesting in your whole section on new challenges is sometimes you'll have a perennial issue. Abortion is certainly one of those. Homosexuality is that. And of course, you have chapters on that. But some of them have morphed. The homosexuality issues then leads to the particular discussion on engaging the transgender debate. Even the abortion debate gets into an issue of what do you do now that we've had post-Dobbs and we're in a different kind of world, and it isn't so much a national issue but a state and local issue, and some of the phrases and arguments are being used differently, and we're talking about an abortion pill versus an abortion clinic. So it does seem to me that once again we recognize that even the so-called perennial issues have some different challenges that we need to be able to address in the 21st century.
Here's the way I break it down. There's timeless issues and there's timely issues. So timeless issues, does God exist? Is Jesus God? Is the Bible true? Why is there evil? We will always have those issues, even sexuality. But then there's certain timely issues that arise from our cultural moment. So if you had told me in 2007 that I would update this, 18 years later and have a chapter on transgender, I think the first thing I'd say is, what do you even mean by transgender? And why would that be a big cultural topic? That's how much we've shifted. If you told me I'd have a chapter by Neil Shenvi on critiquing critical theory, yes, even though I have a master's in philosophy, I would have said, okay, what is critical theory? And why is that going to be an issue in 18 years? So you're right. There's these timeless issues we still need to wrestle with, homosexuality, and there's a chapter on why is Jesus good news for women. Now, we updated that chapter. What I didn't anticipate when we first wrote it is that there would arise 15 years later a debate about what a woman even is. I never would have anticipated that. So culture shifts, and we just keep adapting our methods and our understandings. but keep advancing, of course, the same gospel.
Yes, just even as you were talking about some of those, I said, oh, wait a minute, we did do that one. I may be up to 20 now very easily. So, again, these are interviews that we have done in the past, but these are very well put together, kind of clear statements that can maybe help you understand some of the charts, the information, the quotes are all very helpful. But just in the few minutes we have left, I know, Sean, you are all about practical, and it seems to me that some people might say, well, I'd love to have this on my shelf, and maybe I dip into it from time to time. But the way you've done it is you not only look at some of the issues, but then you do an interview with a key opinion leader, and Lee Strobel certainly is one of those individuals, and Jeff Myers is another, and those, of course, all people that had on the program. So how could maybe people use this in a way that would be helpful to them? Because, as a matter of fact, I didn't even mention you have one just on the whole idea of youth ministry that we might talk about as well, because this is an attempt to really educate you and equip you so that whether you're dealing with your teenage son or daughter, whether you're in a youth ministry, whether you're just trying to build a church ministry or know how to answer some of the questions that surface in the conversations you have with individuals, we really need to have apologetics for this ever-changing culture.
Here's how people have used it. Number one, in classrooms, a ton of classrooms that are on apologetics or evangelism, and they'll just read and study and discuss the chapters. A ton of small groups have worked through it together. I've had a lot of individuals study it. And if someone's listening going, you know what, I just don't minister in urban settings, I'd say, okay, you don't have to read every chapter in the book. That's something I learned. I used to feel like if I bought a book, if I didn't read every chapter, I was kidding myself.
Mm-hmm.
And it was Paul Copan who's like, if it's not helpful, don't read it. And I was like, that's just such good advice. But I think anyone's going to look at this and say, critical theory, you got to know about that. Transgender debate, got to know about that. New thought, got to know about that. Taking the perspective of other people, Tim Muehlhoff, this is how you just engage in conversation and see the world as other people do.
Very good.
Like, everybody's got to read that. How do I help people dealing with doubt? Every Christian needs to know how to do that. So if you're not doing apologetics online, just skip that chapter for now. But I think you'll find minimally half to two-thirds of the chapter just kind of scratch right where you itch if you are trying to reach people with the gospel.
Last chapter, of course, is by your good friend Jonathan Morrow. You two wrote a book together, which I still quote quite often. So, again, if you find yourself saying, I'd kind of like to know a little bit more about how to approach individuals here in the 21st century, this is a book I'd recommend. It is published by Harvest House. You can find out more by going to our website or going to, of course, Sean McDowell's website, Apologetics for an Ever-Changing Culture, a Biblical and Culturally Relevant Approach to Talking About God. Sean McDowell, it is always a delight to have you on the program, and as always, I look forward to the next opportunity.
Kerby, thanks for your continued faithfulness. I'm a fan, I'm grateful, and I appreciate your friendship.
Going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to get into some of the issues in the news. We do have some take action items, and I mentioned those before, but we'll come to those again. Viewpoints commentary for you to follow. Of course, if you'd like to know more about the book, it's all right there. I just, again, could say this is a wonderful book and an update on a resource that I have on my shelf. But now I have two very good resources on our shelf. And, of course, if you're not familiar with a previous book we talked about that I did a commentary on Monday, well, you can find that one in the Viewpoint section. Got a feeling I'll be doing a Viewpoints commentary on this as well. Let's take a break, though. We'll be back right after these important messages.
If you appreciate the trustworthy news and biblical worldview that you hear on Point of View, would you consider joining our team, the Truth Team? Listeners like you have been the backbone of Point of View for 53 years. But today there are more voices competing for Americans' attention than ever before, and few of them are anchored to biblical truth. By joining Point of View's Truth Team, you can be an integral part of keeping truth on the air. In just a few weeks, Point of View will celebrate Truth Team Week. But you don't have to wait till then. You can join the Truth Team right now and help us get a head start on our $150,000 spring fundraising goal. If you appreciate Point of View, please join the Truth Team. Join today by visiting us online at pointofview.net. Or you can call toll-free 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Going through the stations and caught Kerby and a very interesting topic. So just listening to it, and so just by hearing the topic, I can relate to some of those topics. But it has impacted my life a lot. I enjoy listening to the station.
I appreciate Point of View. You've been great and wonderful. A lot of information, and I really appreciate all your work you do.
My wife and I have listened to Point of View for about 17 years now. We just want you to know how much you have meant to us in our lives. I've gotten a real education since I've started listening to Point of View.
I want you to think, what would we do? How ignorant would we be if we didn't have Point of View? And come on, guys, give something to Point of View to make sure we don't lose this wonderful voice. And thanks again for what you do.
Thank you, Kerby. I consider this my school time, so my 2 hours of school each day. So thank you very much.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to get back to some of the comments made last night. One of the articles I've posted is key takeaways from Trump's congressional address, and you can follow that along if you would like to do so. As a program note, let me just mention that tomorrow we're going to have Glenn Pacquiao with us, and we'll be talking about Pastor Pacquiao's What's a Christian Anyway? He's really raising the question that because of our world that we find ourselves in today, sometimes people have thought that the church has lost its way because of politics, celebrity culture, cultural issues, divisive issues, and he will have some comments to make. And I might just add that some of his comments may be different than the ones you heard from Natasha Crane yesterday, and that's okay. I want to give you a chance to hear different ways to look at that. But even this last hour, probably a good illustration of the way in which we try to cover lots of different issues. First half hour, we spent some time with Gary Bauer talking about politics, talking about Donald Trump, talking about the Democrats, talking about congressional issues. Second half hour, talking with Sean McDowell about apologetics for an ever-changing culture. Even this hour, we're going to get into a variety of different issues. Some of them will be judicial, some being political, and that is certainly the case. And I think it is important, if we are going to really apply a biblical world and life view, we need to apply it to every area of life. And politics and the culture is certainly a very relevant part of that. And Christians may disagree about how much they will individually get involved, because after all, not everybody's a hand, not everybody's a foot. If you want to use the illustration the Apostle Paul used about the body of Christ, Christ the head, but all sorts of different aspects of ministry, and that is certainly the case. So we'll get into some of that tomorrow with him, and I think some of the comments he makes about the celebrity culture are really concerning to me as well. We recognize that certain individuals, because they have a best-selling book, all of a sudden then charge what I sometimes think is outrageous amounts if they go and speak for a Christian school or for a pregnancy resource center. And there are just a lot of issues we'll probably get into with him. But let's leave that for tomorrow, because I'm sure in the hour we'll get into some topics that you will want to address. If you'd like to respond to some of the things I'm going to put on the table this hour, let's open up the phones. That number is 1-800-351-1212. And this summary, which comes from our friends at Daily Signal, Fred Lucas put it together, 10 takeaways. I might not look at all 10, but it's a way to kind of get us started. And the first was this idea of common sense. If there was a theme that ran through President Trump's message last night, it was common sense. Common sense has become a common theme and will never go back, was one of his lines. Let me give you a longer statement as well. He said, over the past 6 weeks, I've signed nearly 100 executive orders and taken more than 400 executive actions to restore common sense, safety, optimism, and wealth across our wonderful land. President then went on to say, the people elected me to do the job, and I am doing it. In fact, it has been stated by many that the first month of presidency is the most successful in the history of our nation. Of course, you heard some of that in our conversation with Gary Bauer. And so there has been a concern. And I remember in the past, even before some of this was all that political, that I had a message on uncommon sense. And there's some passages in the Old Testament where you can see individuals individuals applying a very significant amount of common sense. And common sense wasn't even so common even a few years ago, and it seems to have just run out the door more recently. And as, again, Sean McDowell just illustrated, out of the political issue, just in the cultural issue, if somebody had told him almost 18 years ago that you should have a chapter on transgender, he'd say, first of all, what do you mean by that? And why would we want one like that? Or even though he has a philosophy degree, why would we want to talk about critical theory? Well, that's critical race theory, that's critical queer theory, that's all sorts of things that came from the Frankfurt School. And by the way, if some of that sounds a little unfamiliar, do you have kind of a Cliff's Notes version of that? The answer is yes, there is. My booklets that we make available are certainly going to address things like critical race theory and where does that come from, and transgenderism and all the rest. So there are some very interesting comments just about this issue of common sense. Another one that Fred Lucas talks about is, after all the boos and heckling, Trump went off script and talked about with these Democrats here, there's nothing I can do to win them over, to get them to stand, to smile, to even clap. And as we talked with Gary Bauer, that was certainly the case. So I'll skip that one. It's pretty obvious. But number 3 was restore true democracy. You know, one of the battles during the campaign and even before, it was obvious that Trump was going to be the presumptive nominee. This was going back almost 18 months or almost 2 years ago, was that democracy is dying in the darkness. And so we're fighting for democracy. Well, Donald Trump decided to take that on as well. My administration will reclaim power from this unelected bureaucracy, and we will restore true democracy to America again. He signed Schedule F executive order that makes it easier to fire bureaucrats. I've heard some people express their concern, which I think is legitimate, that some of this may be happening too fast. Probably some mistakes will be made. I mean, we're talking about human beings, talking about individuals with a limited amount of knowledge, sometimes making decisions. But the argument is incrementalism certainly hasn't worked. It's going to take all we can to do anything to, as he calls it, drain the swamp. This, of course, gets us to a couple of others, and one of those is the issue of the national energy emergency. He says, I terminated the ridiculous green new scam. He was doing all he could to kind of tap the chests of a few of the people in the room, withdrew from the unfair Paris Climate Accord, which was costing us trillions of dollars. And so, again, some of the focus was on trying to, as he later went on to say, drill, baby, drill, and recognize that if we want to try to bring prices down, one of the things that was driving prices up was limited energy. If the energy that you put in your, for example, car, or the energy you put in your water heater, the energy you put in to heat your home, the energy that is needed for a trucker to bring food to the grocery store, the energy needed to actually keep that grocery store cool. I mean, you just begin to think about, if those particular dollars drop, that's the way in which you can prevent the prices from going any higher. Will they drop? Not necessarily, because that's going to get to one we'll talk about after the break. That is the issue of tariffs and a few other issues. But that, I think, is just a brief look at a few of the takeaways from the speech last night. We'll come back and pick out a few more and then get into this issue of the transgender sports. I put that article there because it reminds us of the fact that, okay, if you think that Donald Trump is wrong for saying that there's only a man and a woman, you think he's wrong for banning men from women's sports, what's your alternative? And this is where Noah Rothman's piece talks about the incoherence of those who have opposed the Trump executive orders. And so we'll get into that in just a few minutes. We'll be back, but also we'll open up the phones, give you a chance to join the conversation. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
homelessness not only affects big cities, but can be found in small towns as well. Scott Moorfield tells a story about Bristol, Tennessee and Bristol, Virginia that illustrates the impact that public policy can have on social problems like homelessness. First, let's explain the geography. Bristol is really two cities with two governments that are right next to each other. They are divided by a state line that runs down the main street. The division provides a perfect test for the impact of laws and policies. One past example of the differences came during the pandemic and lockdowns. The Democratic Virginia state mandates were much different than the Tennessee policies. It created a weird time where half of the main street was essentially shuttered while the other half prospered. More recently, Tennessee passed a law that made camping on public property a felony. As you might expect, the homeless problem gravitated towards the Virginia side. The kitchen director of the local shelter said that he heard numerous people at the evening meal say, "I'm going to get this meal, and then I'm going to go over to Virginia so I don't have to worry about getting thrown in jail and have a felony on my record." The principle is simple. Remove the incentives and create disincentives for homeless people, and they go elsewhere. In this case, they migrated to the other side of town. It wasn't long before Bristol, Virginia passed a camping ban, though it was merely a misdemeanor offense. 3 months ago, I talked about the book by Michael Schellenberger with the arresting title, San Francisco, Why Progressives Ruin Cities. He documents various reasons why the homeless problem has become worse, but one of the most important reasons is lax enforcement. The two cities of Bristol illustrate how policies do affect homeless behavior. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let me just mention real quickly that, of course, the tariffs are the most controversial, and I think we are going to probably have to take the good with the bad. On the one hand, some of these tariffs have been very helpful in forcing countries to begin to reevaluate the way in which they treat American goods, and that's where he said, whenever they tariff us, we tariff them. But a long-term tariff is going to, as we've already pointed out, increase the cost of goods and services that come to this country, and certainly one of the more controversial aspects. He said we've been ripped off for decades by nearly every country on earth, and we will not let that happen any longer. He's very concerned about the trade deficit. Of course, we tried to educate you about some of that, and we'll come back to that again, but I do believe that that's one of those ongoing issues we'll be watching. And if you've been watching the stock market, and I know some of you perhaps are, the concern about the tariffs is one of the reasons why the stock market is, I guess a nice word, underperforming. Let's get a few others on the table here. One, of course, was the issue of the back and forth with the Ukrainian president, Zelensky. I'm going to get to that one in just a minute because I did allude to that with Gary Bauer, some of the influence that I think Senator Chris Murphy, who's becoming kind of a rising star right now in the Democratic Party. Zelensky had met with them before, and that was the case. But the argument has always been that, well, you're just a Russian shill or something like that. But he last night made it very clear that simultaneously we've had serious discussions with Russia and received strong signals they are ready for peace. But he also made the case, if you want to end wars, you have to talk to both sides. Ukraine is ready to sign any time that is convenient convenient for you. And so that is on the minerals part. There's kind of a three-step process. One has to do with the minerals. One has to do with security. One, of course, ultimately gets you to a peace accord. And there's a lot more that needs to take place between now and then. Also, of course, he talked about Laken Riley. America will never forget our beautiful Laken Hope Riley. And, of course, one of the things that we talked about with Gary is sad reaction or lack of reaction sometimes to some of that as well. But this brings us now to this issue of transgender topics. And that is, he talked about his executive order cutting off taxpayer funding to any institution that engages in those actions. Highlighted the story of January Littlejohn, a mother who saved her 13-year-old daughter from a transgender ideology, and then came to that very poignant statement that Gary Bauer mentioned just before we let him go. That is, the president said, "Our message to every child in America is that you are perfect exactly the way God made you." And this, I think, brings us into some of the issues in the other article I've posted by Noah Rothman, and that is many times we're talking about 80% to 20% kind of issues. And certainly when you get into the transgender issue, it's sort of an 80-20. And so I'm always wondering if indeed you disagree with 80% of Americans, how you make your case. Maybe you try to appeal to a person's emotion. Maybe you try to give some facts and figures. But oftentimes what happens is you just simply label them as transphobic, and that's supposed to be the argument, and it's a really poor argument to put it together. And Noah Rothman reminds us, as we just talked about with Gary Bauer, that the success of the Democratic Party were able to block a Republican-sponsored bill that would have barred federal funding for schools that continue to allow male athletes to compete in women's sports. This was an attempt to deal with an issue that has been kind of front and center in the Democratic Party. And, of course, as we've already pointed out, we have our take action items. And even here, you have the presidential executive order that is at the moment protecting women's sports. But the bottom line is the next president possibly could, with an executive order, replace that. So I oftentimes, when we're engaged in a back and forth, I want to hear what is the best argument you have on your side. And I will give you two. One comes from Senator Tammy Baldwin. When the legislation was put forward, she said that the bill was an attack on localism. In other words, it's an attempt on the federal government to overreach. She said, for example, "I, for one, trust our states, our leagues, our localities to make these decisions without interference from Congress or the president." Well, Noah Rothman raises a very good question. If you're concerned about having local autonomy, if localism was the solution to this issue of a cultural conflict, why then did Democrats craft a national standard compelling the inclusion of transgender males in women's athletics? Why is it that when you had President Joe Biden expanded the Title IX protections to include prohibitions on discrimination based on gender identity, and more importantly, when there was a measure that was put forward to allow for common sense exceptions to this blanket national standard, did you shoot it down? So the first argument against banning men from women's sports came from Senator Tammy Baldwin, and it was based on the idea that the federal government should have no place in that, coming from a party whose previous president and whose particular legislative council wanted to prevent anyone from being able to have an exception. So that's argument number one. The other one comes from Senator Dick Durbin, and he said that the bill lacks a clear enforcement mechanism, could subject women and girls to physical inspection by an adult if someone from an opposing team accuses them of being transgender. That's an argument that AOC has been used. Does anybody really take that seriously? I'm not sure if you're a boy or girl, so you're going to have to strip search for me. Do you really think that's going to happen? And again, that is kind of a argument that I don't know that it needs a whole lot of explanation, but nevertheless, that one was one. And then there's one other one which is kind of interesting, and that is a few of the Senate Democrats argue that, well, it's really not much of a problem. Well, then if it's not much of a problem, why can't we just make sure that it just never becomes a problem? And you can see that what we have here are arguments that sound somewhat convincing, but if you just take a moment to kind of bring them apart, take them apart, evaluate their meaning, I think you're going to come to the conclusion that that isn't so helpful. And I think this is one of the reasons why I wanted to post this piece by Noah Rothman on Democratic incoherence on transgender sports. On the one hand, you say this. On the other hand, you've been doing just the opposite. Don't you just pay attention to what people say. Pay attention to what they do, and I think you can learn some lessons there as well. Finally, I thought it would be helpful to mention just a few of the others on this website that we posted, some of the takeaways. One of those is, of course, the idea that some of these woke ideas do not belong in the military, which is exactly why Trump declared wokeness is going to be gone from the schools, the military, and more. Our service members won't be activists and ideologues. They'll be fighters and warriors. Sounds like Pete Hegseth. But again, these are sort of what you might call 80-20 issues. Most Americans think that we want to have a military force that is going to be able to rival any military force in the world, defeat any other military force in the world, at a time when China is raising some really significant concerns. We're going to be talking about this over the next week or two, especially since our next Outlook magazine addressed that issue, and that is the case. And then finally, as we pointed out, whether it was Laken Riley or the other one, the wonderful story of this 13-year-old individual, DJ Daniel, brain cancer, his dream to become a police officer, all dressed up like a police officer, and the president made him a Secret Service agent, and just illustrates again the fact that when he's talking about cancer, also said that he has encouraged the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., to reduce childhood cancer rates and to figure out why that is happening. So those are just a few of the many highlights from the speech last night. And when we come back, we'll get into some other topics that certainly need to be addressed. And, of course, if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to know a little bit more about some of the issues we've addressed, we've posted some articles on the takeaways from the Trump speech, Democratic incoherence on transgender sports. Just a few minutes, I'm also going to talk about maybe the Democrat that was behind some of the Zelensky disaster. And Cal Thomas has some comments about Ukraine ministers speaking truth into that issue as well. So we'll cover some of the issues of Ukraine. All that coming up right after these important messages.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if we can, let's spend just a few more minutes on this issue of Ukraine, the dust-up or the back and forth or whatever you want to call it, the conflict between President Zelensky and President Trump. We now know a lot more. I suspected quite a bit from the time, and a lot of it goes back to Senator Chris Murphy. We talked about him in the first hour. I talked about him yesterday. It is becoming more and more obvious that he may be seen as maybe even the presumptive nominee to actually lead the Democratic Party and run for president 3 years from now. We'll see where that takes us, but he has been everywhere saying all sorts of different things, tying together some conspiracy ideas, which I pointed out from a piece by Byron York on Monday, which seemingly make no sense at all. But that is not the issue. There is a good deal of evidence to suggest that he is the one that actually recommended to President Zelensky to go in there and try to get a few more concessions from Donald Trump, maybe even blow the whole thing up. Now, I recognize, as I've said before, whether it's last night watching the State of the Union address, although it's an unofficial State of the Union address, the speech before Congress, or watching that meltdown that took place in the Oval Office on Friday, everybody comes with their preconceived ideas. Some people say that it was a setup, it was an ambush, that this was just an attempt by Donald Trump to portray Russia as the good guys and to advance the Russian talking points. You hear that on one side. On the other side, of course, you've seen individuals say, I can't believe that President Zelensky was so unappreciative and actually destroyed the meeting. We now know a few things that Zelensky said under his breath. If you can understand Russian, you know he said some pretty nasty things, but okay, that's where it is. But I think we have also noticed that after a few days of reconsideration, President Zelensky decided he better come back to the United States. There is this wonderful piece that Matt Vespa put in here, which comes from X, where one of these individuals was trying to kind of put this in context. Again, this is a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek, but it says, okay, Europe says to Zelensky, President Zelensky, we have your back. Canada is going to send you an F-18. Hasn't been serviced in 27 years, and the engine is missing. France is sending its finest Peugeot. British are supplying you a 1970s battle tank, but to Poland. And then finally, Zelensky, President Trump, I've reconsidered. And the bottom line is, as soon as President Zelensky went to the UK and other places to see what Europe could do for him, he realized that if you want to have anything likely to counter the Russian military might, you're going to have to depend on the United States. But a lot of this came from conversations that President Zelensky had with Democrats, including one of those, Senator Chris Murphy, who is a senator from Connecticut. Let me just read this piece from the New York Post. I think you'll get the idea. Before meeting Donald Trump, President Zelensky met with anti-Trump Democrats who advised him to reject the terms of the mineral deal the president was offering. This, according to Senator Chris Murphy. Chris Murphy said, just finished a meeting with President Zelensky here in Washington. He confirms that the Ukrainian people will not support a fake peace agreement where Putin gets everything he wants and there's no security arrangements for Ukraine. Okay, that was actually posted on X on Friday, just before that meeting, that ill-fated meeting there in the Oval Office. He attached a picture of Zelensky at a conference table with Murphy seated opposite of him. Earlier meeting with Democrats undercuts the wild claims that Trump and the Vice President J.D. Vance staged an ambush. In fact, it was Zelensky who came with an ulterior motive. Again, that's quoting from the New York Post. The purpose of the meeting was to sign the mineral agreement he and Trump representatives had negotiated. Matter of fact, they were going to sign it without even having a press conference, but nevertheless, that's the case. He had twice refused to sign it. After promising to do so. I told you that story about the conversation he'd had with the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. But then, thanks to Murphy, we now know he had no intention of signing it on Friday. By listening, again, this comes from the New York Post, to the nakedly partisan advice of Democrats, instead of dealing forthrightly with the current president, President Zelensky portrayed his countrymen and now at least leaves them without the military and diplomatic protection that only America can provide. Looks like that's been reinstituted since this was written. And, of course, then they go on to say, good luck counting on Britain, France, and the rest of Europe to save Ukraine. Maybe the Germans will send Strudel, and, of course, you can get the rest of that piece, which we've posted for you as well. One of the individuals that we tend to watch every once in a while on CNN, wouldn't recommend it for the faint-hearted, but there is one outstanding light sometimes in the midst of some dark statements, is a man by the name of Scott Jennings. Scott Jennings sometimes goes for the jugular, and in one of the things he posted on X said this, that is, he's referring to President Zelensky. He has obviously learned a valuable lesson. Never, ever take the advice from Chris Murphy of Connecticut unless you need a clown to make balloon animals at a child's birthday party. As one person said, kind of wicked stuff, but it illustrates, again, what was going on there. So there was a desire to sign the mineral agreement, probably going to do so. But to be fair, and I always get criticized for trying to give the other side, I've also posted a very good piece by Cal Thomas in which he talks about the conversation he had with a number of ministers from Ukraine. And this is eye-opening as well because, as I've said before, there are two sides to any story. You've heard the phrase, it takes two to tango or two to tangle, and that is the case. And to be fair, let's recognize this is the case. Cal Thomas said that while President Donald Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance and Ukrainian President Zelensky were duking it out in the Oval Office, we also had 6 Ukrainian Christian ministers from different denominations who were coincidentally or prophetically down the street telling guests at the Institute on Religion and Democracy how Russia is treating people inside the territory it has occupied. By the way, I think very highly of the Institute on Religion and Democracy. We used to have guests from there and probably need to do that again. One of those is a minister from the Ukrainian Pentecostal Church. He told Cal Thomas that 700 churches of all denominations have been deliberately damaged or destroyed by Russian rockets and by soldiers wearing badges that say Russian Orthodox Church, the only church, he says, the Russians will tolerate. So there's a religious element to some of this, which we need to talk about. I asked him about Trump's belief that he can trust Russian President Vladimir Putin to keep his word. The minister from the Ukrainian Pentecostal Church said, quote, even when Putin speaks of the weather, you can't believe him. We don't trust a word he says. Would you trust someone who has killed millions of people? Would you trust a deal with Osama bin Laden? So you can see why there is a great deal of skepticism, I think rightly so, on the part of the Ukrainians that we can never trust the Russians. One of the other individuals in that meeting is the president of the Ukrainian Union Conference. He says his grandfather was murdered by the communists when they ruled Russia. Cal Thomas asked him about the Ukrainians who tried to flee the country. He tells of a group of 140 he knows who tried to escape and seek shelter from a constant drone and missile attacks. Only 12 of the 140 made it to safety. Some were shot, others just disappeared. So again, it is just a reminder of the brutality of the Russian army, of the fact that war crimes are obviously being committed, and those particular issues should never be forgotten. Even if we try to bring about some stalemate, some kind of peace negotiation, even some kind of ceasefire to prevent this from going on. He also, Cal Thomas asked about the reports of widespread corruption That's where the individual made the argument that only about 5 to 7% go into the Ukrainian treasury. But nevertheless, we have weapons and ammunition, but some of them have been sold on the black market. So there are obviously some other issues that they addressed. But if you really wanted to get a sense of the point-counterpoint, that's why I wanted you to know a little bit of the behind the scenes, which is in this third article, Democrat behind Zelensky disaster. But if you wanted to understand a little bit of what it is like to be on the ground in Ukraine, that's why we have that fourth article by Cal Thomas, Ukraine Ministers Speaking Truth. Those are both available for you to read. They're a couple of troubling statements that you might imagine, because we're talking about a brutal war taking place between Russia and Ukraine. Posted those on the website. Obviously, we may come back to this issue again, but I think we need to move on to some other topics. There's some decisions that came down today that you need to know about. We'll talk about those right after these important messages.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's see if we can talk about a couple of issues that you do need to know about. One was announced last night by President Trump, and that is he announced that Mohammed Sharifullah, who is the ISIS terrorist who orchestrated the attack at Abbey Gate, that's where on the way out of town, on the way out of Afghanistan, we had 13 Americans killed in this attack. Well, the individual that was responsible, the ISIS terrorist, actually was, as he said, was on the way to the United States. He has now arrived, and you might remember last night that he said that he will face the sword of justice from the United States. You would not have known that would happen if it hadn't been for the president to have announced it last night. Maybe we'll see some news reports about it here, but that goes all the way back to the botched withdrawal that took place in Afghanistan and the death of 13 individuals, American heroes. So we'll talk about that probably this weekend, maybe on our Friday weekend edition. I know Dr. Merrill Matthews, Patricia is going to be with us, a couple others, so we'll do a roundtable discussion about that. And also another one that I wanted to announce real quickly is the fact that the Supreme Court has ruled that President Trump must unfreeze $1.9 billion in foreign USAID payments. This is amazing to me. First of all, as we pointed out just a minute ago, or at least an hour ago, probably better to say, but we do need to come back to it again, that some of these district court judges are trying to hamper what Donald Trump is trying to do. No surprise. Remember when he was trying to build the wall, some of the district court judges prevented him from doing this or that. And, of course, ultimately some of these will be resolved in the Supreme Court. But that takes time. But interestingly enough, this is a case where you have Justices Thomas, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Alito that are for, but you, of course, have John Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett that went with the liberals. But in their dissent, ask a very important question. Does a single district court judge who likely lacks jurisdiction have the unchecked power to compel the government of the United States to pay out and probably lose forever $2 billion in taxpayer dollars? The answer to that question should be an emphatic no, but a majority of the court apparently thinks otherwise. I am stunned, says Justice Alito. So that's something else that even in an attempt to try to cut funding, some of those funds which have been frozen have now been unfrozen. In this case, it's not a final ruling from the Supreme Court, but a decision not to change the district court ruling, which for now illustrates again how we are going to have a long, protracted battle over the issue of DOGE. So again, just wanted you to be aware of the fact that there are a number of things, a victory in terms of bringing to justice the individual that led to the killing of 13 Americans. On the other hand, spending $1.9 billion through USAID payments that I think you've now heard, many of which go to some pretty questionable actions. That there's where we are. Just before we end, I did mention that President Zelensky has changed his mind, and I thought it might be good just to read, just real quickly before I get to some other issues, what he has said. Because, again, sometimes you have to explain what he's writing. And President Zelensky said, quote, Ukraine is ready to come to the negotiating table as soon as possible. He went on to say, my team and I stand ready to work under President Trump's strong leadership to get a peace that lasts. He went on to say, we do really value how much America has done to help Ukraine maintain its sovereignty and independence. Okay, there's an appreciated comment. And here's the one that probably would not make sense to you, because he said, and we remember the moment when things changed, when President Trump provided Ukraine with javelins. We are grateful for this. Now, if you don't know the military terms, we're not talking about a javelin you throw in track. We're talking about what is called the Javelin anti-tank missiles. In his first term, when Donald Trump gave the anti-tank missiles, the Javelin anti-tank missiles to Ukraine, that actually stopped the potential invasion by Vladimir Putin. So he's hearkening back to the time when there was no invasion in Ukraine, when Donald Trump was in power, when he had provided them with some Javelin anti-tank missiles, which pretty much stopped the possibility of a Putin invasion when Trump was in office. Then Zelensky, after saying, "I appreciate this," went on to say, quote, "Our meeting in Washington at the White House on Friday did not go the way it was supposed to go, not go the way it was supposed to be, I guess is how he said it. It is regrettable that it happened that way. It is time to make things right." And then finally, he also says, regarding the agreement on minerals and security, Ukraine is ready to sign it anytime in any convenient format. We see this agreement as a step toward greater security and solid security guarantees, and I truly hope it will work effectively. It is quite possible that within the next couple of weeks, that blow up, that dust up, that conflict, that shouting match, whatever you want to call it, may just be a footnote in history, so we will see how it unfolds. Let me just mention again, we have our action item, but my commentary today is entitled Flight from Work. We'll get into this probably sometime in the next week or so, but it's just a reminder that as we have many times watched the television host Mike Rowe, really as an advocate for people to go into some of these occupations that don't require a college degree, he has been very concerned about the fact that we have, as you've heard me say on this program before, 7 million men ages 25 to 54 who are not only not working, they're not looking for work. That quote, which has been used by Mike Rowe, actually comes from Nicholas Eberstadt. He's been on the program with us in the past. He's an economist working with an organization, a think tank in Washington, D.C., and actually was part of one of his commentaries entitled Flight from Work. We have at least 11 million unfilled jobs. Donald Trump is trying to bring more jobs back to the United States. That certainly is happening because of the threat of some of these tariffs. He talked about some of that yesterday. There's some other reasons for that. But if we bring jobs back to America, and then American men won't get those jobs, won't go and use their technical expertise or just their brute force and willing to learn a new trade, we're going to be in a very difficult set of circumstances. And one of the things I've appreciated about J.D. Vance is, let's not give up on American workers just yet. But we're going to have to change the mindset a little bit. And we're going to, if we're going to bring jobs back to America, in some cases manufacturing jobs and jobs that involve welders and steam fitters and pipe fitters and mechanics and things like that, we better also do what we can to encourage young people to learn those skills and to seek out those professions, to seek out those places of employment, because we will need them. And actually, they can make a very good living doing those kinds of jobs. So again, that's my commentary today. I'd encourage you to read it, maybe pass it around as well. Most importantly, we're out of time. So I want to thank Megan for her help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. We are looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. It's going to be an interesting interview as we talk about what it means to be a Christian and how we can go forward as Christians in the 21st century. So I look forward to seeing you then right here on Point of View.
If you appreciate the trustworthy news and biblical worldview that you hear on Point of View, would you consider joining our team, the Truth Team? Listeners like you have been the backbone of Point of View for 53 years. But today there are more voices competing for Americans' attention than ever before, and few of them are anchored to biblical truth. By joining Point of View's Truth Team, you can be an integral part of keeping truth on the air. In just a few weeks, Point of View will celebrate Truth Team Week. But you don't have to wait till then. You can join the Truth Team right now and help us get a head start on our $150,000 spring fundraising goal. If you appreciate Point of View, please join the Truth Team. Join today. by visiting us online at pointofview.net. Or you can call toll-free 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net, and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
Going through the stations and caught Kerby and a very interesting topic. So just listening to it, and so just by hearing the topic, I can relate to some of those topics. But it has impacted my life a lot. I enjoy listening to the station.
I appreciate Point of View. You've been great and wonderful. A lot of information, and I really appreciate all your work you do.
My wife and I have listened to Point of View for about 17 years now. We just want you to know how much you have meant to us in our lives. I've gotten a real education since I've started listening to Point of View.
I want you to think, what would we do? How ignorant would we be if we didn't have Point of View? And come on, guys, give something to Point of View to make sure we don't lose this wonderful voice. And thanks again for what you do.
Thank you, Kerby. I consider this my school time, so my 2 hours of school each day. So thank you very much.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.